have planned some slides about some very general art topics that I think are kind of not talked about enough in art school for whatever reason, and it's just kind of a list of things that I wish I had learned a little bit earlier. So yeah, I'll just get started. I have a few slides with a little bit more of my work in case you haven't, so you can see where I'm coming from. So my stuff tends to be environments and keyframes, a little bit of storytelling. That's kind of my focus. And I in general, I think most of the industry is a little bit split up into kind of environment focused artists, generally speaking. Some people cross over, and then there's like character artists and designers. And then some people are really good at both, and I don't understand how they do it, and that's okay. But this is just kind of generally the direction my work has taken. So I just kind of wanted to show you this so you can see where I'm coming from. I've kind of seen a little bit about I've seen some of the social media of the people in this group, and I kind of get a sense that there's a lot of people who are interested in going into character design in this group. So I've kind of tailored some of what I'm going to talk about a little bit less about my process, because that's very specific to this kind of environment stuff. And I have resources at the end in case you are interested in learning how I do this. But mostly I'm just going to talk about some topics I think that apply to everybody in the industry, if that makes sense. So right now I work at DreamWorks on this show, Fast and Furious Spy Racers. There's a few seasons out on Netflix right now, and I do some matte paintings and a lot of visual development for like environments and keyframes, also for like moments in the show. And it's been a really fun and great experience. It also was my first job in like a big studio, DreamWorks. So I've learned a lot from it. So just to note kind of where my career's at right now. I also have one last slide about myself before we jump into what I want to talk about. So this is just kind of my learning journey. I think it's important to note this because, well, I kind of started out at LCAD for a couple of years, and I think I was mentioning before, at the time, there wasn't an entertainment design program. I think there is now, if I understand correctly, but it wasn't quite as focused in concept art as I was hoping for. So I ended up leaving and trying Brainstorm School, which is a very small kind of concept design focused trade school, which is really great. And then I ended up taking some online classes at Learn Squared. And then it's kind of like devolved a little bit from like very organized like university, and then I sort of ended up smaller trade school and then online classes, and then I just kind of watching people's Gumroads and learning from that, which is just, if you haven't heard of it, it's just a site where people can post their video tutorials. And then just learning on YouTube all the time, because I think you should be learning all the time from everyone if possible. And now I literally am at this moment just learning from as many sources on the internet as I can, just bits and pieces. But I bring this up because I think if I think like the most that I've learned, kind of not the most, but I've learned so much from just random different sources on the internet, and I think it's great to kind of supplement your learning journey from all these amazing resources that we have online during the course of your education. So I have some more resources at the end that I'll talk about that I think have been really helpful to me, and we can talk about that a little later. All right, so let's get into it. So this is the contents of what I'm going to talk about. The first section I'm calling "How to Get Better at Art," which is a bit silly, maybe, but I heard a talk by actually one of my current freelance bosses, Shaddy Safadi, who is the art director at One Pixel Brush. And I'm just going to steal straight, with his permission, from one of the things that I think was incredibly helpful to me. And then the second part is going to be called Shape Design and the Power of Control Z. We'll get there. And finally, why taste is more important than style. Again, just all kind of topics that I think will be really helpful to everyone watching if you're interested in the entertainment industry. So yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so there's this law called the Law of Increasing Awesomeness. Okay, and this is a bit silly, so bear with me. But imagine your art education is you climbing a mountain range. Okay, and we all kind of have our art gods at the top of this mountain range that we think we kind of think of them as art gods, which is a bit silly, but they're like kind of like the goal, in other words, of where we're trying to get to. And then there's you down at the bottom, and me too, by the way. I'm also at the bottom. I have my own set of art gods that I'm trying to learn from and become as good at a variety of different stuff. Okay, so kind of when you start out, at least when I started out, the 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 trick was how to learn. Okay, how do you learn? How do you learn? I don't know. So the problem is like sometimes it's not so clear because there's let's clear this fog for a second. There's so many different mountain peaks that you can try to get to. Okay, you can try to have like a really realistic art style, whatever that means. You can try to do um, maybe anime style. You can try to just do a general like animation industry peak. Okay, there's kind of a lot to choose from, and I think this is more and more the case as time goes on, just because online resources are growing exponentially all the time. So it can be a little bit challenging to pick what the peak is that you're trying to climb. Okay, that you're trying to get better at. Okay, and one mistake that I think a lot of people end up making is, and I did at first as well for sure, is that I kind of started climbing up this mountain. Okay, I was like I had picked an art god or a few art gods that I was trying to get. I was trying to understand how they did it, right? And I was starting to climb up and climb up and climb up, but then I got distracted. I also had an art god over here, and I also had an art god over here, and I couldn't decide which way to go. And instead of following a straight line of how that particular single person got good at what they're good at, I kind of got distracted and then fell down an avalanche, and then had to climb, start over sometimes, and then again like switch my direction. But I think if you're starting out and you just if the goal is to get a good job as quickly as possible, the best bet is to kind of specialize in what the goal is as much as possible, and just go from point A to point B as quickly as possible. And then once you're really good at a certain thing, once you've maybe you didn't quite get to the very top of this peak, maybe you only got to here, but you start getting jobs, you start getting a sense of where your career is headed. Then I think it makes more sense to kind of explore a lot more of different styles and techniques and just what your goals are. Okay, and you see this a lot where like really talented, really amazing artists who have a really kind of steadfast career, then they end up sort of exploring other techniques, and I think it makes more sense because they have that base of their career kind of centered. Does that kind of make sense? Can you guys even hear me?
Yes, sounds good.
Awesome.
Okay, cool. I know this is a bit silly, but I think it's so important for getting jobs and kind of just finding your way. Okay, so for me, for like my art, I'm not at the top. I'm like somewhere in the middle here. I've made like a little base camp. And if you don't want to do art like the way I do it, if you don't want to make designs that look like my stuff, then don't follow my process or my tutorials. It's so easy to just get distracted and be like, oh, cool piece of art, I'm gonna go that way, and kind of end up wasting a little bit of time if that's not the direction you want to go. Okay, so all of that aside, I'm just gonna mention for a second what is the ultimate explorer in this example, in this metaphor. I guess a lot of fine art is like this. I just picked this example, Mark Rothko, who's like a famous abstract painter. And I like this. It's very orange. It's it's got like a feathered edge, which is cool. It's interesting. you could see that basically what Mark Rothko is doing in this example. He like found his direction and then he went way this way. He's got his own path, right? He's having fun. He's designing. It's like the ultimate artistic expression. He's just expressing his feelings, and it's cool. And don't forget, let's see. I think this painting sold for $86 million. So if your goal is just to make money, this isn't necessarily the wrong path. It's just what you want to do. Okay. By the way, he got really good at doing this. If you Google Mark Rothko, this is what comes up. Um, he got really good at doing abstract squares. Okay, and that's the direction his like personal journey. He wasn't going to someone else's peak. He was making his own path, and that's cool. That's fine. But a lot of jobs in the entertainment industry um, are centered, I think, in one particular grouping of mountains. Let's say, okay, there's like a general sense, and it tends to not be floating squares in a red field. Okay, one more point on this. It's a bit silly, but I think this kind of thing happens a lot in art history. I'm not going to talk about art history too much because that's boring. But even when you look at like the Renaissance and like that kind of resurgence of amazing art, what they were doing, according to my metaphor, is they were building on what the Greeks had done. I think it was the Greeks, right? That's like these nods to an older style, literally in the painting, but also they were standing on the shoulders of like the laws of perspective and color theory and design that literally other artists had discovered, right? The Greeks were their mountain that they were headed towards, and that's what's interesting, I think, about some of art history, because you see this a lot where it's like one group of artists tries to like learn from another group. So here's an example of like that much earlier Greek art, which I think kind of was amazing in a way. There's like really cool stylization and really cool technique, and everything was like very technical, and the musculature was really on point, and they even like the drapes of the cloth were incredibly just carefully done. It's so amazing. But what's really crazy is, a little bit later in history, some libraries burned, some whatever happened, the Black Plague, I don't know, and then art in a lot of Western Europe took a different turn, which is not a great turn, in my opinion. I just found this as an example of bad medieval art. But what happened? This is so much later, right? This is all the lessons of this were completely lost, and they kind of start over and went their own direction. I cannot believe this front view, by the way. It's one of the most spectacularly bad things I've ever seen. But I have one more point about this before I move on. I think a lot, before you say this is just like a different style than the Greek stuff, take a look at this. This is the similar period from Greek history than those previous cultures. Okay, and look how stylized that is. That's amazing. I think I love this. The stylistic choices made here are beautiful, and the stylistic choices made here are very lumpy, questionable, and not even just the anatomy being wrong, which is like kind of obvious, but the stylistic choices made, like the way this hair is just a wiggly line, and then there's like another wiggle that's an ugly wiggle, and then there's like another ugly wiggle. Those choices, okay, are there? I think they were trying to stylize what's real, what's in real life, but this is just a more beautiful interpretation. So I think if they had like, I guess if they had copied, quote unquote, or if they had looked more at what these choices were, maybe it would have been better. That's my take. Is that all making sense so far? So I'm going to try to apply that to modern concept art in this next section, okay? Because that's enough art history. Shape design and the power of Control Z. This is something that I know applies to the industry, because when this was finally drilled into my head enough, I started getting jobs, and I don't think it's talked about enough in art schools. I think the tendency of art school tends to be you're learning technical stuff, which is really important, right? Like how to draw realistically, or whatever style you're doing, how to make things look real, and also how to stylize is sometimes talked about. But I don't think the shape design aspect of all of that is kind of talked about enough. Okay, so here's what I'm talking about. There's a concept that I call vibe check, which is an abbreviation for it should be both visually iconic and believable in some percentage breakdown. Okay, so what does that mean? Let's look at this for example. This is visually iconic, and this is not visually iconic. In other words, the actual graphic design of this shape is really interesting. It's a beautiful shape, okay? And we can talk about why exactly it's quote unquote beautiful. Like there's a lot of reasons, I think. Like there's a small curve here, then there's a big curve here, and then there's like smaller details in there, and then that creates kind of like an interesting visual variety. It's got small stuff, it's got big stuff, it's got straight stuff, it's got curved stuff. I think that's part of why it's beautiful, and part of why this isn't. But if you just look at the graphic design of this, if you were just take this silhouette, it's such an interesting silhouette, and I think that's the lesson here. That's the visually iconic part. Okay, the believable part is where it gets interesting. Let's look at the vibe check again. So visually iconic, that's the individual shapes and also the overall shapes. It's just making it a strong statement that's iconic. The believable part is whether you recognize that it's a horse. Can we recognize that this is a horse? Yes. I can see that both of these are a horse. So I think when depending on how much you're stylizing something, that is when the believability becomes a little bit less important, and the visually iconic part becomes a little bit more important. Okay, so that makes sense. So both of these are slightly believable in that I can see they're both a horse, but only one of them is incredibly visually iconic. Okay, so again, I think it's easy to say that this is just a stylistic difference. So let's take a look at some other stuff. This is Claire Wendling, who's an amazing artist and draftsman on the left here. This is her drawings that I found on Google, and you can look her up, and she's got amazing, amazing drawings. And this is just a random picture of a horse being attacked by a lion that I found. I guess it's George Stubbs, 1765. But let's see if we can break down what the vibe check. See if the vibe check applies to either of these. So, is this visually iconic? To me, it is. Okay, because the choice is made in stylizing the pose and also the shapes with like that actually make up the details are interesting shapes. Okay, so this mane has got a really cool kind of like big shape here, but then like a little shape here. And each individual piece of that mane is such a cool and dynamic, interesting shape. Okay, same with the horse, same with all of this. It's just so cool. But also, there's like the shapes that the shading has made is an interesting shape. Kind of maybe by accident, maybe not. The shapes within the overall pose are dynamic. Okay, and then look at this for a second. To me, this is so bad. I don't. Sorry, George Stubbs. I hope there's nobody disagrees with me. But aside from like the anatomy being kind of questionable to me, where like that's a technical thing. That's like a totally separate problem. But then also like the stylization of these shapes within here aren't as dynamic to me as this. Does that kind of make sense? So it's like the choice is made to show this is a cheekbone, like this shape, kind of blobby and not that dynamic and interesting, versus like this cheekbone. Look at that; it's so cool. It's got this small curves against a larger curve, and then there's like a small little detail there, which is kind of like what this all leads to. Does that kind of make sense? So to me, this is the way to do visually iconic stylization. This is not. But the believability part is kind of interesting because this, you might say that this is more believable in that it's more realistic, right? In a way, like that it's the shading is taken further. The lighting, I guess you could say, is sort of an ambient lighting, so it's taken a little bit further. In a way, it's got more detail and more rendering and more believability than this, right? Um, but I think in terms of like what my taste is, which one I like better, is was in this scenario, it was more important to focus on the visual iconic aspect of this. Does that make sense? And this happens a lot with artists. One more from like art history. Norman Rockwell. These paintings are super famous, and he's got like a lot that are very, uh, very, I don't know, cutesy and like small town American feel. But it's you can find all of his photo ref online, and I think it's really interesting because the choices that he made with this, like even just her face here, to stylize it just a little bit. It's just like, I guess the forehead is a little bit bigger. It's like a little bit more visually iconic. Whatever, he turned the face looking away. What else did he do? I mean, you can look at this for so long and just try to decide why he made those choices. I guess the expression is stylized, but but at the same time, it's so believable, right? Like the rendering of it is super realistic in a way. I mean, it's got some brushy strokes in there, but I think overall, it's pretty hard to argue that that is a fairly realistic painting. Um, so there's a few more that let's look at some like more modern concept artists. This is Jamie Jones, who's one of my favorite concept artists working today. This is a painting from Destiny, the video game. I think it was concept art to determine. I mean, it was to determine a lot of things, but one really interesting thing about it, I think, the stylization of the shapes within everything. First of all, is amazing. Like, look at this hair, this shape. Look how he broke that up. Like the lighting, it's got a blue lighting from above. That's like the skylight. It's got direct sunlight coming from over here, which is this shape. But he could have chosen to make that shape in any way that was just an ugly shape, right? This light shape right here. It's so cool. And then there's within that, even like the brushstrokes make kind of interesting shapes. Um, I think that's really important and just not talked about enough. Like there's so many amazing concept artists out there that I see, um, who do really great work, but just don't focus on that enough. And then they get too focused up in the believability and not enough, right? Like somebody could have rendered each individual hair in here, and it might have been more quote unquote believable, but it's just so much less interesting to look at. Here's another one from Jamie Jones, same artist. This is interesting because, like in this background, um, there's such big strokes in the painting and so little detail information, but it just reads perfectly, like right away, as like interesting stuff, just in the background. Same with this like foreground stuff. It's like an interesting patch of snow, and there's like an interesting pathway that leads you into the picture as a graphic shape, which I think is really cool. But he's also good at that with characters, not just the environment, which is awesome. Speaking of characters, I want to talk about one more, or okay, a couple more. I get excited about looking at awesome art, so let's do it. Nico Marley, I think it might be Nicholas Marley if you look it up. Um, I think he did a lot of the character designs for DreamWorks films, and I just really amazing stuff. And in my opinion, some of the best character designs for animated stuff out there. So yeah, granted, this is for animation, so the shapes that were chosen to stylize are going to be more exaggerated, right, than maybe if it was for a live action feature or something like that. But the the overall flow of each one is so cool. So like this one right here, for example, you can like follow his lines, right? If you imagine like your eye flowing along this, and then it like flows along, and you're these like happy little round flowy shapes, and then you get this like awesome note of detail with like this little, like you can see the fingers, you can see the small hand. So it's like large swooping shapes that are beautiful in themselves, leading to a small area of detail that's really interesting and kind of a focal point. Okay. I'm sure I don't know that much about character design, but I'm sure it's the same general feeling of like a focal point that you hear about with a lot of environment art, um, where it's like these larger areas that are kind of negative space in a way. Like there is this shape is meant as an area of rest to lead you to this focal point, which I think is really cool. Um, here's another one, so cool. Same stuff I think is interesting about this, where it's like, I guess the area of rest is even more of an area of rest, like how simple this giant black shape is, right? So that it can contrast with this area of detail, all these little awesome details. But if this belly here was like really detailed, that would just distract you from what's interesting about it. So the choice to make that simple actually makes everything else, all the details, stand out in a really cool way, which is awesome. Oh yeah, he also did the How to Train Your Dragon stuff, and I included this one because it's not it's visually iconic, okay, but it's not like the shapes are as beautiful as, like, let's say the Greek horse sculpture we were looking at before. So let me just take a sip of water real quick. It's like, in a way, these shapes are there's like all these bulbous and hilariously almost like ugly shapes, but they're visually iconic. Okay, that's an important distinction. In that, like, you see the visual language of this bulb and then all these other little bulbs, right? So that's like the visual iconic language of this character, even though they're not like beautiful shapes in and of themselves. I mean, they kind of are. Some of them are. This is beautiful. This like curve that leads to the area of interest and detail. So it's kind of a mixture of both. But I think it's important to learn because to understand that, because depending on what you're doing, depending on what you're designing, sometimes you want the feeling of something to be ugly, like to be not. But that's kind of the charm of it, right? Is that it's a bit ugly and hilarious. And then last artist I'll mention in this category is Ryan Lang, and I bring him up because he has worked on a lot of amazing animated movies, such as Moana, but he also works on Marvel stuff, which is the end product is going to be, look at this painting, it's so cool. But the end product is going to be like live action, super CG realistic, right? Versus Moana. Where is it? Versus Moana, which is very stylized in a way. I mean, there's realistic textures, but the shapes are super stylized. But I think the reason he can work on both properties, Moana and Avengers, is because everything is so. I guess it's that vibe check again, where it's like the lighting shapes are visually iconic, right? And not just the lighting shapes, but like the overall silhouette of this rock is an interesting shape. That's cool on its own. And then there's like these shapes in here that are so interestingly broken up, but also showing the believability of the lighting being lit from above, right? So it's that balance between, again, the vibe check, visually iconic, but also super believable. And then the same exact principle, I think. I mean, you should look up his tutorials if you want to do art like this, because I don't know how to do this. But I think that it's the same principle of that balance between visually iconic and believability that makes this super, super realistic. Where let's take this guy for example. Even though the materials are rendered to look really realistic, right? Like this gold has like a bounce light down here, and then it's got like a core shadow, and all those materials are totally believable and realistic. Look how stylized this light shape is up here. It's so beautiful. This, if you zoom out, this white light shape of this guy's arm is such a cool shape. If you were just draw that as an abstract shape, it would be interesting. I would hang that on my wall for sure. just that clip of that light shape. Um, so I think because he really understands both those aspects and how to balance them well, that's why he can work on both such a wide variety of properties. All right, so that's enough about shape stylization. Let's talk about this last section. First of all, is everyone good? Can everyone hear me? I'm not talking to a. I can't actually see you guys, so if anyone's like raising their hand.
Oh yeah,
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, cool. So I'll just keep going then. So this is the last section. So why is taste more important than style? This is super important for getting jobs, I think, because there's so many different. I guess if you want to work in the entertainment industry on like different IPs, like the Avengers or Moana or whatever, I think there's too much of a focus on what your style is in art school in general. I mean, a lot of people talk about this. You might have heard about this from other people, but it's your style. I think should be how you present yourself. It's like the way that you're presenting your art. Okay, but I think what your taste is in terms of subject matter and like what you have to say is more important for an art director to that would look at your portfolio and hire you based off of that. Like, does your taste line up with their taste? Okay. So I have, if that's confusing, I have a slide like just defining it. So what I think style and taste is. So like the style being the way that you render your textures and the realism overall of your shapes and all that, versus the taste is kind of the subject matter mostly, and also the design a lot. Was like a design taste that I think you can identify with a lot of people, and just the overall feeling. Okay, so here's some examples of that. Which one is your is your taste? These are very different tastes. Okay, Pacific Rim is like the most outrageous mech hilarious design that they can think of, and it's fun and hilarious, but also ridiculous and huge. And then there's Chappie, which is this movie about this little super believable robot. Who's like not only on a scale, he's like the same size as a guy, but you could feel that this is a functional thing, and it's like totally like I could see that walking around. It's so grounded and so realistic in a lot of ways. Not to say that this isn't realistic in terms of the way it looks, right? The style of it is very realistic, but the taste is and to me is totally opposite ends of the spectrum. Okay, so here's another example: World of Warcraft. Um, this is interesting, I think, because there was like this World of Warcraft property, and they made it into this totally different, realistic rendered movie, right? Which apparently was terrible. I didn't see it. I also did not play World of Warcraft very much, the game, so I apologize if I get something wrong. But I think this was a like a marketing type illustration, basically. And what's interesting is this is like a totally different style, right? Like the way this is rendered. This was a painting, so they didn't try to render like the exact texture of the hair. The style of this is like a bit more quote unquote concept arty, I guess, where the textures are sort of stylized. It's also a very Blizzard style in that everything's chunky and a bit silly, but also in a very fun way, where it's like this armor plate is absolutely preposterous in its like size and the way it's broken up and the shapes of it. But what's interesting is I think this is, even though it's a totally different style in terms of how it's rendered, like how it's presented, right? Like it's super realistic, and you know the each hair is there, and the materials are believable. But the taste isn't, to me, isn't that far off. It's actually a very similar taste. And by what I mean by that is, if you like this, if you like huge orcs with ridiculously big, chunky armor, that's a bit silly but fun because it's silly. That's like what your taste is. So if you had like a portfolio of a lot of this taste, that might fit you into like what the type of stuff that Blizzard does. Does that make sense? So it's like, again, just totally different styles, but I think a similar taste. And the reason I think the taste aspect is more important is because there's so many examples of awesome properties and IPs where you have such a wide variety of style, of artists, totally different artists that work on the same property. And I think that's because of their taste. Okay. So as an example, this is John Howe, who I think he was doing like Lord of the Rings illustrations, and kind of before the movies were ever made. And I think the Peter Jackson took him, or like reached out to him, because his stuff was so iconic as what the Lord of the Rings looks like. Okay, and then he hired him onto the Lord of the Rings movies. Um, but what's really interesting is like he has such a specific style, John Howe, where it's like if I see any of these, I know immediately it's John Howe painting and drawing. Like he's got this like really cool, I don't know, what would you call that? It's like a almost watercolory, but also some graphite style. And so all the negative space is really interesting in a way because it's got this like washy feel. Um, so that's like such a specific style. But what's interesting is his taste lined up exactly with what I guess Peter Jackson wanted with the taste of the Lord of the Rings. And what I mean by that is look how it's like very realistic in a way. It's much more grounded than the World of Warcraft stuff, even though this is like it's stylized in that it's cartoonish a little bit. Like these faces aren't super realistic, but the taste of them, the way they feel a bit darker than the World of Warcraft stuff, and like a bit more sinister. Like I can kind of feel the personality behind this guy, in that it's like just all the little details that make up his personality. I think that taste lined up exactly with like this. It's like slightly stylized, slightly cartoonish, right? But it's also very grounded and realistic in that, not the style again, but the feel of it. Like you can, this guy feels evil. Does that kind of make sense? It's the same with Star Wars, by the way. Ralph McQuarrie, who did uh, the original. I think this might have been actually the very first concept art ever for Star Wars, which is crazy because it looks. I mean, these guys look exactly like that in the final product, almost. I mean, a bit different, but the feel of it is exactly spot on, even the like environment and everything. And then all this stuff. I think this was the first illustration of Darth Vader, which is crazy how similar that ended up being in the final product. And I think that's because he has his own style. These are Ralph McQuarrie paintings. I can tell that by the rendering type. But his taste of these huge, iconic, good versus evil, black and red, and these shapes being super simple and graphic. That's his like design taste. That was just spot on for what I guess George Lucas wanted Star Wars to be. Does that kind of make sense? So if you have like a portfolio of let's say of orcs, okay, you can make them any style that you want, kind of within reason. But I think what a lot of people will respond to, art directors included, is what your taste feels like. Okay, that's like the emotional thing that makes them think, oh, I know what this person was trying to say. That's the kind of art I want on my project. And then the last example of this, I love this example. Norman Rockwell, I talked about him before, versus J.C. Leyendecker. I think they both, I just saw this on Twitter, so if someone heard about this, maybe. So my apologies. But I think they both had to do, at some point in their careers, they both had to depict like the graduate, the fresh-faced graduate who is going to make their way in the world. And what's really interesting is there's a totally different style, right? J.C. Leyendecker's style is so over the top and insane and cool and stylized. And Norman Rockwell's style is so much more grounded, like the rendering of it. But look how different their taste is. It's like the exact opposite. I would hire one of them to work on my IP, which I don't have, but if I ever were an art director, I would hire them based on their taste, not on how the end product looks. I mean, in a way, I would kind of get the feeling, depending on what's needed, I might look at their style a little bit, but I think the more important thing is like which feeling that they have. Okay. And then I also have in here an example of my old work as the final cherry on top for this last section, because this is my hilarious old work on the left here. This is my more recent last year work on the right. Um, Actually, I think I did these while I was in LCAD, actually. That was about five-ish years ago. But looking back at what I've learned, I think there's a few lessons that apply directly to everything we've talked about so far. So first of all, my style has changed in that I've learned how to make things a little bit more realistic for what I'm trying to do. Okay, so like but what's interesting is my taste hasn't changed all that much. A little bit. I still like fantasy forests and dragons, and even like the color palettes are a bit sort of speak to me in the same way. That's like my taste, right? But there's a bit that has changed in my style. Like I've learned how to use photography and 3D and all that stuff to make super realistic stuff. I guess you could say my taste has changed in that I used to think this was cool, that like there would be giant statues with bellies. I don't even know what I was thinking there. That's horrifying now, but I used to think that was cool, and now I don't think it's cool. So that's my taste changing, and now I think this is cool. That's my taste changing. But overall, I think it's the technical stuff that have led to my style being a bit more, hopefully dynamic and a bit more realistic. Is kind of one of the main things that I've learned. And notice by the way, speaking of the shape design stuff, one of the big differences between these two is like this shape is not an interesting shape. This branch right here, and then also this branch comes up exactly halfway in the middle of this branch, which is not breaking it up in a dynamic way. It's like this half is the same size as this half. And then now, if I were to do just a branch, which I did here, if I'm gonna have something so simple as just a branch, the shape had better be a really dynamic, interesting shape where it's like, as a graphic thing, this is like a big swoop that leads to these smaller swoops that lead to these smaller swoops. So at least even though it's a simple subject matter, at least I'm gonna have a really interesting shape design. Um, yeah, thank you. That's the last thing I had. The last slide I just put together a lot of different resources. I guess I can send this to you guys after, um, or maybe if this is being recorded, you can look at this after. But these are just resources that I found helpful and that I can recommend. So really great books on how to draw and how to paint. So don't take any of this from me. Take this from these, amazing art gods. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
How are we doing on time?
We have 20 minutes left in the hour, so we have time for if I don't know. You have those purple slides if you want to show that, or we could do Q&A, whatever.
What do you guys think? Do you have the attention, like 10 more minutes of attention span for bonus design stuff? Or we can do questions if anyone has a burning question.
I'm definitely
design
down
stuff
for
sounds good.
going.
Sure, more info is
More is better.
Yeah.
Hey.
All right. Let's do more info. Bonus design stuff. Okay, so all that I've talked about so far is very general, and I realize that it might have come across as a bit basic, but I think it's all, to me, again, those subjects, the most important things that led to me getting jobs. So yeah, keep that in mind. But this that I want to talk about now is a bit more practical in terms of how to design new things. Okay, so this is a bit more specific to visual development and concept art, right? So if you're not in that field, this might not apply as much. But I think it's really interesting. So let's take a look. So why is the Star Destroyer the most iconic ship of all time? Do you guys think? Why is it so cool? And not only so cool, but what everyone thinks of if they think of a giant evil spaceship. And I think the first interesting thing is that how similar it looks to the biggest, awesome, scary-looking ship that we have in real life. Okay, look how similar. They even took like this shape of this like circle. They even took this like kind of cross shape from that. Even the overall like giant simple diamond triangle shape is super similar to this. And I bring this up because I think when people are first starting out, myself included, in concept art and visual development, there's a feeling that everything you design has to be totally fresh and new and like out of left field, which is the exact opposite of what you should be thinking about. It should be, how can you make this thing that fits the brief, right? They had to make a spaceship that looks cool and evil, but also ground it as much as you possibly can in real life, okay? And break down what you're seeing and use the details that make sense to use as much as possible, okay? And even better if you can use different sources. But even if you just have one, one iconic shape and reference, that's kind of great. That's kind of enough in a lot of circumstances. Okay. Um, Let me think about how I want to say this. So there's, I mean, and you could also argue that this shape is super simple in that it's like a triangle, right, from a top view. That's one iconic thing, and that goes back to the visually iconic versus believability thing we were talking about earlier. Is this visually iconic? Hell yes. Is it believable? Well, it's believable because they took this straight from here. That detail that they took is the believable part. That makes sense. So the artist that designed this, I'm not actually sure who it is. It might have been Ralph Mcquarrie. Um, they knew how to balance that visually iconic statement of this is a triangle, this has got this super strong shape up here, with the details that are believable about this, that we can relate to, and the scale that we can relate to, if that makes sense. So another way to look at this is you can actually break down designs of anything pretty much in big, medium, and small shapes. Okay, I'm sure you've heard about this: big, medium, and small. Okay, so it's so important because it relates to like everything that I do professionally on a daily basis, but also like all the different people that I know in the industry that do totally different styles than me. They also think about this. It's just like it just applies to design in general. And this has a big shape, the Millennium Falcon, right? That's its silhouette. But if you zoom in, there's also medium shapes in there, which are important not to forget about, where it's like there's a circle, and then there's kind of a larger circle, and then it's split up into this kind of pizza shape, right? Those are some of the medium shapes. And if you zoom in even closer, you can actually break down some of the really small shapes in here, where it's like this square panel language, and then there's of course this like cool piping everywhere. So that's kind of like the small language of that. I guess if we were to break this up, this would be the small shapes. Make this on another layer. Yeah, those are like the medium shapes, and that's the big shape. So what's interesting and why that's so important is like, why can we tell that this Lego one is a Millennium Falcon 2? Why exactly? Well, mostly because it has the same big shape, right? The silhouette is the same, exactly the same. Okay, and they also did their best to interpret the medium shapes as close as possible, where it's like circle, bigger circle, pie shape in a way, with Legos, right? So it's slightly different medium shapes, but not that far off. And then what's crazy is this looks like a Lego only because of the small shapes, pretty much. And that's like these bumps, right? That's the small shapes of this. So all this to say, you should try maybe and identify the big, medium, and small shapes of any design that you're making, especially if you have like a series or a scene where they're kind of using the same big, medium, and small shapes. Then you should be at least aware of what those are in your drawing, right, or in your series of drawings. And then my last note on this is kind of how to use that for a new design. This is an artist, Long Q Chen, who I really admire. Um, and these top two are their artworks. And if you, I don't actually don't know them. I'm just assuming that this is their reference because it's pretty obvious. Well, it's so cool how they did it. So like, how did they design this? Where did this come from? This awesome new fresh design. Well, I think that they split up what are the big, medium, and small shapes of these things, and then mix them in an interesting way in the final design, right? So it's got the big shape, of this guy. Pretty much exactly, even down to the way the legs are like hanging, right? It's pretty much got the medium and small shapes of this, where it's like this piece right here corresponds pretty directly, even these kind of medium-ish shapes. And then in this case, I guess the small shapes are like the bolts and the little mechanical pieces. Some of that looks like it was taken directly from this, like in the the smaller details. They were probably looking at a totally different third reference for some of those smaller details that they pulled from for those small shapes. But the big and medium shapes are straight from these references, I think. I'm just guessing. And you can kind of see them like thinking about that in the sketch page. This is the work they had to do to arrive at this awesome design. Just kind of breaking down the big, medium, and small stuff. All right, that's it. Thanks for your attention, guys. Hopefully that last section wasn't too confusing or didn't go on too long. And I'll end on this slide if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, thank you for all the information. There's some good stuff in there. Definitely. Yeah. Take a look later.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I guess I have a question. Like, what would you say? You kind of touched this on your like old art slide, but what would you say your own tastes in art are? It's more of like a personal question, I guess. Or
yeah. I mean, every artist that I showed that I like is like a taste that I like. Pretty much everybody. I guess if I had to be very specific, it would be I don't like this. I'm not a World of Warcraft person, even though I appreciate it. I understand that the reason it's awesome is because it's silly. I tend to like slightly more grounded stuff like John Howe and Lord of the Rings orcs, if that makes sense. And you can kind of, might be able to see that in my work. I'm not sure, but just generally speaking. But that's not to say that I don't appreciate the style of the artists, right? Like this is cool in its own way. It's just my taste kind of ends up landing in a slightly different, hopefully more grounded area. Yeah.
Cool. Gloria, you said you had a question in the chat.
Yeah. So Pace, looking at that slide that had your work in it, it's pretty apparent that you're technically like a very skilled draftsman. Now, when it comes to your professional portfolio, did you create multiple portfolios, like a more stylized one? Do you send different work out to different like studios, or do you just have one and you send just work to a studio that is the type of work that you want to be doing? Or, can you provide some feedback for our students here on things that they might experience?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think I also had this question when I was starting out. Like, should I make two different portfolios? Like, what's the move there? And I guess what I've learned, what's interesting is I currently work at DreamWorks, which is like sort of more stylized animation, you could say. But I also have worked on like realistic properties, like slightly more, realistic style games and TV and stuff. And I think my take is it doesn't make sense to like split your focus into two totally different styles and areas. So I think the best thing I would say is if you kind of going back to that mountain, actually, if you kind of have in your mind at least a little bit of the general part of the mountain range you want to head towards, that's ideal. And then you can kind of tailor your portfolio. So like it doesn't have to be super specific. Like let's say you want to work on The Last of Us at Naughty Dog or something. It would be great if you could do artwork that looks like their stuff, right? Like the artists that work there. That would be super specific and tailored. But that's kind of maybe risky. Like if you don't get a job there, then you only have a portfolio that looks like Naughty Dog stuff. So if you can kind of pick like a few companies maybe, that kind of fit in that realistic, grounded, that studio is very realistic, very grounded type of thing, then that would be ideal. And I think it's better not to split your focus, especially if you want jobs faster, right? Because then you're going to spend too much time just too much time figuring out how to make stylized stuff look good, and too much time figuring out how to make realistic stuff look good. And then, like I was saying before, one last thing, I think my taste applies to a larger variety of companies, and the style is less important. Kind of like I was saying before, so like my stuff being realistic, well, DreamWorks still kind of wants realistic stuff in a way. Like, this is the show I'm working on. There's stylized aspects to it, but they still have realistic stuff. So yeah, and that part of my stuff sort of applies to a lot of different categories. Does that kind of make sense? Answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to kind of point people in the right direction, that taste is kind of what underscores everything.
It really is. Yeah, and oh yeah, that's all. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question.
Please.
So in the news today, it was revealed that Disney is shutting down Blue Sky Studios, and
I was wondering
what your thoughts were on like the fewer studios and where the entertainment industry is headed, like as a whole, in terms of new and original content.
That's a tough one. That's like the entertainment industry is so big and broad. I mean, really, they're shutting down Blue Sky Studios? That's terrible.
Yeah.
They did like Ice Age, right?
Yeah,
Ice Age. Favorites.
I just watched Spies in Disguise. I like that movie a lot.
Oh yeah, I saw a trailer for that. Yeah, I mean, I guess my hot take on that would be, I guess in general it depends. It depends kind of what area of the entertainment industry you're interested in going in. So like animation, for example, is sort of, I think, a bit dominated by these huge umbrella studios like DreamWorks and Disney, right? And then there's like very more niche, more almost like indie animation studios out there, which have a totally different, again, taste and style. So I think those will kind of always be there. There'll always be like indie small stuff. I don't think Blue Sky is an indie studio, but I think it's sort of split into those kind of categories. So yeah, if you're like thinking of making a portfolio, just keep that in mind, like which of those categories you're kind of headed towards, if that makes sense.
Actually, oh, sorry. I have a related question. What would you say is the difference between applying to like a big studio like Disney or DreamWorks versus a smaller studio like Cartoon Saloon or Laika?
Yeah, do you mean like what type of work you should have for the two?
Yeah, and also like how competitive is it comparatively, and like you know, because I would imagine that it would be like certain positions would be more competitive going into like Disney, but also smaller studios like Laika and Cartoon Saloon also probably have less jobs available since they're just smaller and have less resources and money. Yeah. So I was just wondering about like, I don't know what the process is like.
I actually don't know some of the answer to that question. I haven't applied to that many small indie studios, and I don't think I've ever really worked for them. DreamWorks was like my first big job, so I only have experience with that, and then some freelance, but that's different. So I can't really speak to like what they're looking for or like how competitive the difference is. But I will say, my opinion is that you shouldn't set your career path to something like that. You should pick what you really want, whether you want to work for a smaller studio or something like Disney, and just tailor all of your education and all of your art and all of your portfolio to that one specific goal. And then, you know, if it's like more competitive, well, it might take longer, but like I really think you'll have a better time if you're working on what you really want to work for. Does that make sense? That's just my take. That's kind of like, some people might say, you know, you should split up your focus, you know, on where the jobs are. But I just don't think that is like a recipe for success, because like what makes your art stand out is always going to be if you're excited about it, right? So if you are making art for a portfolio that you're really excited about, for a company that you're really excited about, it's going to be better every time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's just my advice. But yeah, anybody else? These are great questions.
I've got a question. Oh, you want to go?
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, you know what? I'm going to switch off my screen share so that you can see my face. But go ahead.
All right. This is kind of specific, but I've seen that you've done a lot of environment design. Do you have any resources or examples for landscape composition in particular? Because that's a big thing. It seems
Absolutely.
kind of
Yeah, actually the best book ever for that, I think, is this book called The Composition of Outdoor Painting by Edgar Payne, Payne. Is that
right, thank you.
so? You're asking about like more old master traditional landscape artists,
Sure, yeah.
as opposed to like modern concept artists. Yeah, that book, The Composition of Outdoor Painting by Edgar Payne, it's like it breaks down a set of really great compositions that you can't go wrong using, and you could just use them. I think that's another thing about outdoor painting and landscape. I mean, there's a lot to be said about it, but in general, the more you can kind of like see what's working in other people's art, okay? And don't steal their subject matter, but you can kind of use some of their compositions. If like a certain type of composition is working and you make it your own subject matter, then why not use that composition, right?
Okay.
And yeah, the Edgar Payne book kind of talks about that, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One last question, if time permits.
Please, I got all day.
Okay, so before you landed your job with DreamWorks, what was freelancing like for you? How long did you freelance? And you know, as far as like mentally preparing, or you know, a student for post graduation, that journey. Any insights?
Yes, good question. I think the focus of a lot of students, myself included, when I was in school, I think the focus is in a bit of a wrong place, and not you, but just like the whole industry, where it's like you're a student, and then you have a post graduation section where you're looking for jobs, and then you get a job, and that's sort of like a false trajectory, in my opinion, especially in my experience. To me, it was like I was doing a little bit of freelance while I was in school, and then I left school and I didn't get a degree, and then I started learning on YouTube, right? And then I started working for this small visual effects studio, and then I kept up my learning with Brainstorm while I was there, and Learn Squared also. Those are like great online schools to do that with. So it was all kind of mixed up, like that path. In other words, it wasn't so clear cut. And I don't think that's bad. I think that's important to understand for beginner artists in general, is because art is like a lifelong journey, right? You're always going to be adding to your education, always learning, always, and that's what's fun about it. So, yeah, all that to say, I when I did get my job at DreamWorks, I'm learning all the time, right? I'm still like taking online classes. I just finished like a mentorship with Eitan Zana, who's an amazing artist, actually, who used to work at Naughty Dog. So yeah, I highly advise just constantly like supplementing your education like that, even if you do land a job that you really enjoy, and you know, maybe there's always like another mountain to climb. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, I think that's both very relieving to hear for students, and I think it's also like a little tough to hear, because you know, like, oh, 4 years, I'm still not done. That's sort of, but it's you know, hopefully if you're really in love with the process of learning, it's not a big deal. You know, you just keep going.
That's the key. That's what you see. That's what that law of increasing awesomeness with the mountain is all about. It's like, once you think you're good and you've achieved some kind of mountaintop, then you're finished. Don't ever think that. There's always another mountain. That's life. And yeah, you literally won't get better if you think you're good. you only get better if you think you're bad. At least that's my experience. That's the fastest way to get better anyway. Yeah. But yeah, anybody else? Any questions at all? I hope some of that was useful. And you can always, if you think of something afterwards that you didn't get a chance to ask here, you can always reach out to me on anywhere, email, social media. I'll hopefully respond if I have time.
Yeah, if no one else has any questions, thank you all for coming. This was great. Thank you, Pace, for presenting to us. And
no problem.
Just to everyone here, if you want access to the video, I put the link to the club Discord. I'll be posting it on there. And, you know, once you get it, you can leave the Discord if you don't really want to be on there. But I don't know any other way to get it all to everyone. So if you're not already in there, please join. But yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thanks for setting this up. And I had a great time.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Okay. I will stop the recording.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Okay.